Okay, now that we've talked about Medea as a foreigner and how the ancient Greeks treated foreigners, we also want to talk about women and how they were treated in ancient Greece. One quick question I would like you to ask yourselves: how are women portrayed in Oedipus? Just take a second, reflect on the role of women in that play, and then maybe as an annotation, possibly, make an observation about how that primary source, Oedipus, might suggest to you, a historian, the way in which women were treated generally in ancient Greek society. One of the things we talk about when we talk about ancient Greek storytelling is this notion in character, and Aristotle talks about this. Characters tend to be either praxis-oriented or pathos-oriented. And very briefly, here's what those two terms mean. Praxis means action. Praxis-oriented characters go out and do stuff. They are action-oriented individuals that try to change the world, solve problems. They are movers and doers of society. Pathos-oriented characters are characters upon whom the rest of the world acts, and they are passive and they are victimized, and their most common traits are emotional sort of outbursts. And so one of the things we have very commonly in ancient Greek plays is the men operating as praxis-oriented characters and the women as being pathos-oriented characters, or, and this is where the word comes from, it's different, but as pathetic characters. In the ancient Greek sense, a pathetic character would be somebody that is acted upon and who spends a lot of time sort of complaining and crying and moaning and being sad, right? And being emotional. Pathos is very emotional. Praxis is very action-oriented. So it's just a conceptual distinction that's worth considering. Overall, when we talk about ancient Greece, we in contemporary society have a hard time understanding how gender divided this culture was. We talk about this notion of women as being totally excluded from the democratic process. So it's not really a democracy, right? The idea of silence and submission, that women are essentially passive, that they have no opportunity to participate in the culture in any way, shape, or form. There are a couple exceptions to that, but not very many. We'll talk about those. And that generally speaking, Greek society views them as subservient and sort of basically objects. They're not supposed to do anything but basically do what they're told, play their role. And there are a couple different ways in which we have some nice evidence of that. This guy, that's Aristotle. Here's a quote from Aristotle. As regards the sexes, the male is by nature superior and the female inferior, the male ruler and the female subject. Aristotle, somewhere else in his writing, also makes a note that females are probably just deformed, incomplete males. No kidding. So we have a deeply sexist society and a society that, and the idea of gender division is really important here, is that men occupy the public sphere. And all that stuff we talked about in the previous lecture. It's your job as an ancient Greek citizen to go out in the world and vote and do sacrifices at temples and participate in and watch gladiatorial events and theater and everything. And your job as an ancient Greek woman is to stay inside, at home. So men occupy the public sphere and women occupy the domestic or the private or the home sphere. And that separation of men and women will dominate almost every culture we study in Theater 317. So just something to keep in mind. Let's talk about 4 iconic and public roles for women. And what I mean by iconic and public is, if you're a Greek woman, here are 4 types of women that you see generally speaking in society: goddesses, whores, wives, and slaves. Not coincidentally, this notion is based off a book that I read, which is a really fascinating look at how women were treated in ancient Greek society. And Pomeroy, the author, breaks down these 4 categories and notes the sort of traits that women might or might not be able to get away with exhibiting. Our first category is goddesses. Now, because the Greek pantheon has all sorts of different gods and goddesses, there are all kinds of different roles that women might imagine for themselves. But all of the Greek goddesses tend to have a handful of somewhat similar traits. Some of these traits are things that a Greek woman would admire and aspire to. Others are traits that would get her in trouble. And we'll kind of talk about that balance. So on the left there, we have Aphrodite, the goddess of love. Clearly, the female notion of beauty, of sexuality, and of association with emotion and love is key to almost all goddesses, but Aphrodite especially. In the middle, you have Hera. Hera, as you know, is Zeus's wife. And in Greek mythology, the worst possible thing that can happen to a human woman is that Zeus falls in love with them. Right? Because here's how that goes. Zeus falls in love with them. Zeus falls in love with you. You got to do what he wants. And then Hera comes along and gets really pissed off at not Zeus, but the human woman. So Hera is reasonably so, but Hera is portrayed in a bunch of different ways, but one of the most major recurring character traits of Hera is she's jealous and vindictive. Some of the worst things that happen to humans happen because Hera is pissed off. So we have, on one hand, love, beauty, and sex, obviously. On the other hand, we have this notion of this vindictive, jealous, petty backbiting, which is obviously not a great trait. And then on the right, we have Artemis, goddess of the hunt. She's one of the goddesses that is very Praxis-oriented. Artemis goes out and makes things happen. And so there's this interesting mix of power and of beauty and sexuality and of proactiveness, but it is undermined in a lot of ways in the Greek religion by the idea that women are sort of emotional and petty and backstabbing and vindictive and not very nice. So this is one notion of femaleness that an ancient Greek man or woman would have. Another one at the other end of the spectrum is the notion of prostitutes. Whores are common in a way that is hard for us to understand in ancient Greece. Imagine, for example, a state-sponsored brothel, right? So we think about the number of things in our current society that are state-sponsored, like the BMV. So imagine going down to wherever the BMV is, and right, you go in there, and then next door to the BMV is the state-sponsored, like the Indiana local-sponsored brothel. This is a common practice in ancient Athens. Women are expected, a certain class of women are expected to be sexually subservient. And these are both sort of pottery evidence from the day. The woman on the left is drinking a little bit of wine and flirting with her customer. And on the right, we have a woman tying up her clothes after she and her customer have done their business. So Athens is really familiar with prostitution. It is a common everyday thing, and it is an expected role for a woman. So what does that mean, right? Well, obviously, we can look down at prostitutes in a whole bunch of different ways. They are subservient. They're basically owned by the state, right? They have to have sex with whoever pays them, so that's not a good position. But there is a little bit of power in being a prostitute for two different reasons. One, men want you, so there's that power of sexuality. But there is also an economic power. These women are independent, and they earn a living. They get paid for what they do, and they actually have income. Most ancient Greek women don't have any income. So I'm not saying it's desirable to be a prostitute, but I am saying that in ancient Greece, prostitutes were a little bit complicated. They were lower status people. You could look down on them, but they were also had a little bit of power in a way that could maybe make ancient Greeks nervous. I'm not so comfortable as an ancient Greek, as a conservative ancient Greek society member. I don't know how comfortable I am with women with a lot of spending money. Then we have wives. Wives are effectively and simply passive, subservient, and supportive. Wives are not much more than property. On the left there, you see Penelope. That's Odysseus' wife, right? And so the story from the Odyssey is, while Odysseus is off running around doing all these amazing, crazy, adventurous things, Penelope's job as a woman is to just sit there and look pretty. And all kinds of suitors come and bother her, etc. But, right, she doesn't really do much. And wives, generally speaking, don't do much. They take care of the private sphere. On the right is just a kind of interesting image of an ancient Greek wedding. But when we talk about what I mean by the private sphere, women are not supposed to leave the house. In fact, it's a status symbol in ancient Greece. If you are pale, that is a high status thing, because it means you are so wealthy, you have enough servants that you never have to leave the house. So paleness is a point of pride, because you get to stay home is a good thing, right? When you are outside of the house, if you do have to leave the house, you don't make eye contact with other men. Frequently, you need to be wearing a veil. And essentially, you're this like protected commodity. So wives are little more than possession in the ancient Greek context. Then we have slaves. There's an enormous category of slave people, right? You saw from the earlier triangle of the breakdown of ancient Greek society, right? Over maybe 100,000 slaves, both men and women. Slaves are on the left. You see women being demonstrated as a plunder of war. One of the things that happens in war, right, and this would have happened when the Persians came in. If you're living in Athens in 480 when the Persians come in and sack the place, you're probably going to get made some kind of sex slave if you even survive it. And this is a common thing for Greeks to do to other societies that they conquered as well. So sexual slavery is a really common thing. On the right, you see a slave who is effectively serving as a nurse, a nanny, or a wet nurse to a regular Athenian citizen. And that nanny, that in-house slave, would not only have taken care of the baby, but would have been required, consensual or not, to take care of the husband. And it's just kind of an understood thing in ancient Greece that the husband has sex with his wife, but he also has sex with the house slaves whenever he wants to. And that's an entitlement. Obviously, the theme I'm getting at here is it's not very good to be a woman in ancient Greece unless you're a goddess, which nobody is. So we have this notion of this gender-divided culture in ancient Greece, right? And if you're a woman, you can dream of being a goddess. Really, the closest you're ever going to get to being a goddess is a priestess at a temple. So that's kind of a high-status thing. That's something. But other than that, right, we have whores, wives, and slaves, and there really aren't a lot of options. So what I want you to look for as you read Medea, and come back and make an annotation on this, and then we'll talk about it in class. How do we see these four primary roles portrayed in the play? What women do we see in the play, and how do they act? And then we have all these expectations put on Medea, who is a wife. Does she act like a wife? In what way does she play the role of wife? Does she complicate that role by acting like a goddess, by acting like a whore, by acting like a slave? Is she asked to act like a slave? Keep these things in mind, and then how the audience would have felt about that. And so kind of along those same lines, when we're talking about how the audience feels about things, we need to think about this guy. The playwright, Euripides, has a very different take on what it means to be a citizen of ancient Athens. Whereas Sophocles was like sort of the poster boy for all things fantastic and wonderful in Greek, right? He was in the government, he participated, he was in wars, he did all the stuff. Euripides really doesn't like the Athenian culture very much. It is possible, this is a legend, maybe it might be true, that he lived in a cave outside of Athens. He was kind of antisocial. He didn't really want to participate in all the democracy and all the religious ceremonies. So he's kind of this countercultural figure, which is a really interesting place to come from. His style and structure of his plays overall is not like Sophocles. Sophocles has this like perfect geometric Aristotelian structure that you could diagram out. Playwriting-wise, Euripides' style and structure can be a little bit all over the map. And as you read Medea, I want you to kind of keep an eye out for the way in which his structure is not necessarily conventional or expected. His agenda then, rather than, as Sophocles does, rather than saying, "Yay, Athens, we're the best, this is great," what we see time and again in Euripides' plays is complicating the audience's ideas, is questioning what they already believe in a way that can be really upsetting and troubling, frankly, to ancient Greece. And one of the things that resulted from that is that he wasn't as beloved as Sophocles. It's something that's important to remember, that Sophocles is, again, like the poster boy for ancient Athens, and he was just the best guy. And Euripides is more this countercultural figure who's sitting out in this cave, sort of throwing rocks at the Athenian wall, going, "I hate you guys." But before we get to the discussion questions, keep in mind that Euripides, even though he was so countercultural, they still watched his plays. He didn't often win the city Dionysia. He frequently finished second or third, but he was still in it. So the Greeks had this flexible enough mindset to listen to a guy who gives us non-traditional, complex characters, uneven plot structures, and sort of agendas and ideas that really complicate the ideas held by the audience of ancient Athens. So as you read the play, show me where we get this outsider notion, a countercultural person in the play or people in the play. And then take a look at Medea and how the play is structured. Look at plot structure, things like exposition, inciting incident, all of the sort of Aristotelian structure. Try to make it fit. It kind of doesn't. Try to make the characters fit. Go back to your aesthetics notes on the definition of a tragic hero. Who's my tragic hero in this play? That's an interesting take on it, right? Then add up for me and come up with some kind of argument or answer. What is he trying to do with this play? Especially with regarding foreigners and women, because those are two huge topics in ancient Greek society. And with this play, Euripides is commenting directly on them. And I'd love to hear what you guys think he's trying to say with this play, because that's certainly something that's tremendously important.